Hello and welcome everyone to another great session in our webinar series from the EU Values Network. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Alexander Mesarovich, a highly esteemed scholar who is currently a Max Weber Fellow at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Alexander has a distinguished academic background with his PhD from the University of Edinburgh. His research delves into the intersection of politics, governance, and institutional reform, with a particular focus on Southeastern Europe. He has contributed extensively to understanding the nuanced dynamics of European integration, informal governance, and policymaking in transitional contexts. In addition to his book, which I will leave him to tell us all about today, he's authored several publications and collaborated on research projects addressing the intersections of European policy, informality, and governance. Joining Alexander as our expert discussant today is Dr. Irena Petrovic, a distinguished researcher and assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Belgrade. Her research interests include social changes in Southeastern Europe, methodology and statistics in social research, and political and economic elites. Irena offers a wealth of insight into the dynamics of informal networks and their broader implications for governance and policy. So this session is hosted by the EU Values Network, a collaborative John Monnet network aimed to create dialogue and a broader understanding on the EU's normative values. Do check out our website to find out more about what we get up to, follow us on social media, and if you like today's session or indeed any of our work, it'd be incredibly helpful for us if you could give us a follow online or sign up to our mailing list. We will email you on a quarterly basis only to send you exclusive curated reading lists and roundups of our research. So on behalf of the network, I would like to thank Alexander, Irena, and all of you in the audience for joining us today. I will now hand over to you, Alexander, to share the key findings of your book. If you'd like to share your screen when you're ready.
Okay, sure. I will start sharing. Let's see, we just tested the tech. Here we go. Yeah, okay. The slides are up. You can see the slides.
Yes, you're good to go.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome on behalf of myself as well. Thank you all very much for attending the webinar. I'm very excited to share my research, right? It's a lovely moment in someone's career when you publish your first book. So this is a very happy day for me. So yes, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my findings in my recently published book, Europeanization and Informal Networks in Southeastern Europe, right? So let's start off with an overview, right? So the book is sort of about what the book says it's about, right? It's about Europeanization and informal networks in Southeastern Europe. But of course, more specifically, it's structured on the research question of under what conditions do or did informal political networks impact EU accession in Southeastern Europe, right? So this is an interesting research question. So it's interesting to me on a personal level, right? Which I think it is interesting to many people on a personal level, because we all understand informality at some basic level, right? We all know what it is to have, certain types of friends. We know certain people are better connected than others, right? There are different informal practices in a variety of countries, right? But often informality is not necessarily taken into account when looking at sort of formal models of political processes. So the driving impetus behind this research question was to try and sort of bring these two sort of fields together in and around the subject of EU accession in Southeastern Europe, right? So in the book, right, I work with two main theories of EU accession, of Europeanization. So I study Europeanization as the external incentives model, right, to be on Schimmelpfennig's work. And then I also consider Europeanization as a case of policy learning, right, drawing on the definitions of policy learning by Claudio Rodelli. And then in my book, I compare three countries, right, Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. Examine them from when they first signed the parliamentary period in which they first signed their agreement with the EU until accession, right, in the cases of Slovenia or Croatia, and until 2020 for Serbia, right? So within this sort of three-case comparison, I've got two success cases, Slovenia as the most successful case, given that they joined in 2004. But Croatia as a sort of middle case where, they did join in the end, but it took a little bit longer. The process was slightly more difficult. I'll get into more detail on this in a second, right? And then I have Serbia as the sort of failure case, right? Obviously, the success or failure, right, are slightly judgmental terms. But within the three-case comparison, with the stated goal for all three countries being to join the EU, right? Serbia then is the sort of case that doesn't, right? The case that fails, the country that fails in this process, right? So I'm trying to study the impact of informal political networks on the outcomes that we see observed across the three cases. So a little on the theory, right? So like I said, I look at external incentives model and Europeanization as policy learning. So the external incentives model, right, is a sort of formal model which argues that EU accession is about changing rules and procedures, right? Countries will make these changes, will go through the difficult processes of reforming the bureaucracy, of changing trade laws, of changing various regulations, right, because of incentives, right? Changes driven top down, by the EU in this case through conditionality. The EU proposes certain rewards. We'll unlock further financing. We will help you with the sort of upgrade costs for infrastructure, right? We'll provide better, sort of loans to help ease the economic reforms. And then with the ultimate rewards being accession to the EU, right? The idea here being that, the EU offers these rewards or potential sanctions, although not usually sort of, strict sanctions like, they're not going to necessarily cut off a particular country. But they're sort of saying, the sanction being a stalling in the accession process, right? But basically, the idea is that countries, it's a rational choice approach, right? Logic of consequence, states will make these changes because of the rewards they're supposed to receive, right? You then also have Europeanization as policy learning, right? So in my book, I define Europeanization simply as accession, right? I know there are many different definitions of Europeanization, right? Different approaches depending on the particular area. But within the framework of accession, I define Europeanization simply as, do you accede or not, right? So the definition of Europeanization I use more concretely, more specifically, is a sort of updating an EUization of ways of doing things. We go back to Routledge's once again, also classic definition, where countries will become European through this process. Once they complete accession, they then are Europeanized, right? So you have this, once again, the formal model of the external incentives, right? The formal conditionality-driven approach versus the more sociological Europeanization as policy learning, where the EU accession is not necessarily about specific reforms. I mean, it is about the reforms. You have to pass the acquis, but it is also more substantially about the updating of beliefs, about the sort of updating of beliefs about what is appropriate, what is good behavior, what is normal behavior, right? And so within the policy learning literature, there are two frameworks, right, that I use in my book. You've got learning in hierarchy, which is similar to the external incentives model, argues that policymakers will learn hierarchically, right? They become socialized into certain practices through the following of rules in exchange for incentives. If we pay them to do X and they do X a lot, eventually people will do X as a matter of course, right? Alternatively, you have learning in epistemic contexts, which emphasizes, instead of sort of top-down incentives, it emphasizes interaction and consultation, right? And sort of as essential for changing habitus, where policymakers, while trying to solve complex problems, will refer to the expert community, will refer to different individuals, and through interaction with them, they will subtly change their understanding of the world, what makes good policy, what makes bad policy, right? And so through this process, they'll become socialized as well in a sort of less hierarchical way, but they'll become socialized into being Europeanized, right, within my particular framework. So these are both good theories, right? So in my book, I define, in my book, right, I come up with conditions for successful Europeanization under these different logics. But what I add to these literatures is that I also include informality. So informality is it's a long sociological tradition, right? Which argues that you can't solely look at explicitly formal processes to understand outcomes. So the Europeanization external incentives model and as policy learning generally, I would say, are applied to the region in a sort of state-centric sense, right? You look at, in the external incentives model, you look at, right, how much money is the state going to receive to upgrade its economy and infrastructure, and is that money enough to induce the state to make the changes required to join the EU, right? But the scholarship in informality argues that, of course, other factors matter, right? The formal rules and institutions are simply insufficient to understand processes, right? Individuals who make up the government, who make up the state, right, have their own individual rationality and preferences. So the amount to which I value some particular rewards from the EU is going to depend on who I know, my position in the government, potential economic links I have, right, my connections to various enterprises or something, right? And so you can't assume this sort of state level rationality, right? Same thing then also with the more sociological approaches in Europeanization as policy learning, because individuals have a wide variety of connections, right, which will change how they understand the relation to experts, the sort of behavior and practices they associate with expertise. And then that will then impact the effectiveness of the socialization processes from the European Union attempting to Europeanize these states, right? So methodologically, I focus on informal networks within the parliaments. So I do this because the parliaments are central to the process, right? It's, you know, the parliaments have to pass the legislation. When you're talking about more substantive socialization, instead of socializing, let's say, a whole state, right, as a sort of macro unit, the parliamentarians and the policymakers there are central to the process. They're the ones who need to become European through this process of EU accession, right, through interaction. They need to learn how to be successful. They need to learn, I mean, this is all within the framework of EU accession, right? But they are supposed to learn through socialization, through rule following, how to be good EU sort of citizens, good EU lawmakers, right? So to standardize across the 3 cases, I only examine the parliaments within 3 cases, starting with the first period, as I said, in which they sign an association agreement up until the session. So this gives the 3 timelines here. I then also conduct a social network analysis of the parliaments and paired with elite interviews to try and capture informal practices and their impact on the formal parliamentary processes, right? So what does this come out as, right? What's the point of this, right? So what this process produces, what this methodology produces as an output, is these lovely network maps, right? I love social network analysis because at the very least, you get a very lovely map that you can show everybody, right? So what do I find in my analysis of the 3 cases? So in Slovenia, both the sort of formal state-led conditions for success are met, as are my modified informality conditions as well for successful Europeanization, right? Because it's the success case, everything goes really well, right? So why did Slovenia join in 2004? Well, the standard explanation is that it is the wealthiest country, right, of the countries in the region. It has also the shortest war, right, during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, so it has the least damage to its economy. The EU also provided a significant amount of aid under the external incentives model, right, to incentivize reform. Lots of technical guidance as well, various sort of twinning missions, right? Individuals from Slovenia were invited to conferences in the EU and workshops and were sort of taught how to better sort of implement policymaking, right? And there was clear and credible conditionality. So under these sort of formal state level conditions, Slovenia is a success case, right? And it accedes as you would expect, right? But I argue that there are then also further factors that were also important, right? Which become more important in the later cases, but just to start with Slovenia. What I found was also essential was that there was a very cooperative atmosphere, very cooperative informal atmosphere in the parliament. So I actually found as part of the research, there was a parliamentary Dixieland jazz band where members of parliament would get together on the weekends and they would play Louisiana, New Orleans style jazz. There's actually a recording on YouTube if you want to look it up under Arte Slovenia, which has them all playing together as recorded on Slovenian national television, right? And this was a response I got, not about the jazz band specifically, but the individuals I spoke with, right, all said the Slovenian parliament was very collaborative, right? There was this sort of group effort around trying to achieve this goal. They would, go skiing on the weekends together. They would spend time. They'd play tennis, right? And that created this really positive collaborative atmosphere that enabled them to pass the required legislation very quickly and also in a sort of robust fashion, right? So the EU requirements were clear and credible to party leaders. This was passed down to an informed party structure and debated within the parliament, right? Which allowed them to join the EU and also successfully reform of these various institutions at a deep level, right? So what you get from the network maps is that, as you see on these network maps, right, each dot is a member of parliament. The connections between each individual, the sort of lines you get there, these are the ties, as they're called, or the edges, to use the social network analysis terminology. These are based on their positions within the parliament, right? So every blue dot, for example, is connected to every other blue dot on the left map, 1996 to 2000, because they're all the same member of the same party, the LDS party, right? So the fundamental network structures I have here are based on formal connections and collaborations within the parliament, but I change the weight of each of the ties. I change how sort of strong each connection is based on the value given to these connections based on my interview responses, right? So you'll see, so these Slovenian maps, the outcome of this is you get this map, right? And this map, the Slovenian maps are very sort of, they're sort of very unified, right? There's a sort of, they're not very like subdivided. There's some small clustering that you get here, right? And this matches the collaborative environment that I found then also purely from the interviews, right? And so collectively, this collaborative structure plus this sort of very mixed network structure allowed Slovenia to pass this legislation quickly and make substantive reforms. Alternatively, then, you have Croatia, right? And you can see here, once again, slightly different network maps, right? So Croatia then is the middle case. Croatia then, sorry, is the middle case. So the standard explanation for why Croatia joined only in 2013 is that, well, there was a war, right? Delayed democratization under Tudjman, right, in the 1990s, which delayed the start of the EU accession process, right? There was then a new accession process started as well, right? The stabilization and association process, higher costs for the Croatian reform because of the long-term impact of the war, right? The war in Croatia lasted far longer than in Slovenia. There's much more economic and physical damage, right? Plus the human cost and tragedy, of course, of the war. But the EU provided more funding, right? There were higher rewards provided to Croatia to support the accession process. And Croatia then also was also invited to this, a similar number of events, right, as Slovenia. And MPs also went on research trips, right? There were twinning programs. And so the standard explanation would assume that Croatia would be successful, and it is successful, right? And my modified conditions agree with that, but with some slight modifications, right? So in Croatia, I found that there was a very hierarchical party structure throughout the period. And this is represented on the maps by the much higher clustering that you see based on political party. So for example, right, in the 2003-7 map, you see these sort of there's a cluster of red dots, right, and another cluster of blue dots. Those are the two sort of big political parties, right? So everyone I spoke to in Croatia said that, especially during the accession period, is slightly different now. They've changed some party regulations. But you were, it was a very hierarchical party structure, right? If you wanted to remain a member of parliament, you had to follow the will of the leader and those above you in the parliament, right? Formally, right, there were no internal elections for members of parliament, right? You ended up on the list at the whims of the sort of party elites, right? And so then this made the life of the parliament sort of very hierarchical. MPs were also generally less informed than they were in Slovenia. I had one interview subject described their work basically being like abandoned children, where especially during the early period, they didn't particularly have access to a lot of information on the process. They said they would have to sort of just squat in the hallway, right, with a laptop when trying to research to look up the EU regulations they're supposed to be passing. And so this impacted the depth of the learning, right? So there were clear credible awards for alignment, for Europeanization, but there's little diffusion of information beyond the sort of base level requirements, right? And so the impact of this in the long term was that while Croatia, yes, did manage to accede to the EU, right, did achieve a level of Europeanization, it was a very shallow reform process, right? Which I argue, right, is why Croatia still ranks relatively low on things like rule of law, right, sort of issues with the bureaucracy, right, low levels of sort of modernization is a judgmental term for it, right? But it's less of a robust, less of a deeply rooted Europeanization process in Croatia than you saw in Slovenia, right? So then to move to Serbia, right? So Serbia then is even less successful, right? So, the standard explanation for the difficulties Serbia's faced, right? The reason why Serbia's not joined is, of course, the cost might simply be too high for Serbia to join, right? There's the issue of Kosovo, right? Serbian recognition of Kosovo. The normalization of relations, right, is a part between Kosovo and Serbia, is a part of the accession process, right? It's not a strict requirement because it's not one the EU can enforce strictly because not all EU member states recognize Kosovo. But of course, this could simply be too high of a cost for the government, right? There's then a credibility problem, right? According to the standard state-level explanations, the process has simply taken too long, right? The EU was distracted, no one really believed in the EU's offers, right? But the EU did also provide more aid, right, than it did either for Slovenia or for Croatia, cost adjusted both in aggregate and in purchasing and per person. right? So there's Serbia in general is just getting more money to continue with the process. There are more trainings being run, right, than in either Croatia or Slovenia. There's, more delegation offices, right? Sort of there are a lot of efforts being made, which according to the standard explanations should still provide some impetus for Europeanization, right? So my modified conditions with include informality argue that it was the hierarchical system plus, Serbia also has a very hierarchical party system, very strong party leaders, relatively weaker sort of MPs, plus criminal clan networks, and generally just low quality of MPs in many cases, right? Parliament in Serbia, although formally quite powerful, informally is relatively weak. I spoke with individuals who would describe working with colleagues very negatively, right? One MP shared the anecdote of when they went on a research trip to the Baltic states at some point to go learn how, right, to go study the parliaments there and learn how parliamentary procedures work there, and better learn how to engage in debates, right, and scrutinize legislation. Other members of parliament from either sort of the radical right parties or the ruling party, instead of attending these events, simply skipped across the border to St. Petersburg and bought a lot of vodka, right? Which therefore then also blocks learning, because if you're not there to study the thing, but you're drunk in St. Petersburg, that will then impact successful learning, right? So in the Serbian case, the loyalty was awarded over competence, which has significant impacts for the successful Europeanization, right? There's then also your incentives individually are not necessarily to bring Serbia into the EU. Your incentives are to follow the leader. A lot of MPs are relatively uneducated, of lower quality, right? The stories of, for example, like this, the parents, right, or sorry, the teacher, sorry, of some other MPs. Kids get promoted to get brought up into the parliament as a sort of nice gesture for passing the kid through his exams, right? Which really impinges the ability of the parliaments to successfully pass these reforms, right? So what does that tell us overall about the system, and what can we learn both for accession in the region for the countries? I'd obviously not for Slovenia, Croatia anymore, them being EU member states, right? But for the other Western Balkan states, and also for the new candidate countries, right? So academically, right, because of course I am an academic, I find that the modified conditions, including informality, provide a more robust explanation than unmodified state-level conditions, right? You can't just look at how much money is the EU paying to make this happen, because of course individuals have their own preferences, ideas, desires, right, their own individual rationality. You can't just look at, right, how many twinning programs are being run by the EU, how many, EU bureaucrats are being sent to the region to talk to people, right? It depends on who they're talking with, how are they presenting their information, or do they have access to the right policymakers, and all these sort of facts, right? So, to return once again to one of my cases, one of the interview subjects described their only experience with one of the twinning professionals as being some old German guy who just sat around in one of the ministries and was lovely. But I don't think that that necessarily led to any sort of deep updating of beliefs about the way things should be done. If there's just a gentle old German guy who's enjoying a nice sabbatical over in the corner, right? You need to have sort of more clear, durable interactions, right? So policy-wise, right, what does that then tell us, right? What can we do to help these countries, to help the new candidate states? So accession should be and needs to be an inclusive process. There is really no substitute, unfortunately, to investing the human time and efforts into making these things happen. This needs to be inclusive both domestically and internationally. So you see, for example, once again, in the Slovenian case, a more durable, deeper reform process than you have in Croatia, because it was a more inclusive process, right? You can get into the EU if you have no meaningful debates, right? If you just simply pass the legislation as quickly as possible, but you're not going to end up with the sort of deeper societal transformations that will make a country sort of more European, right? That will successfully Europeanize a country and will lead to better governance outcomes, right? So I argue, right, that MPs and policymakers should be invited frequently to EU meetings and trainings, right? If you're trying to socialize people into the EU's ways of functioning, you need to make sure they are in the room. You need to ensure that you're diffusing best practice and assistance with expert advice, right? Make sure the people you're sending are good, right? Don't just send random people to the region, right? Make sure that the people you're sending are good. Make sure they're speaking with good people to try and successfully, have the socialization function, right? And you need to also understand the local context. There is no substitute for local knowledge. While it's nice to have standardized sort of formula you can apply to different cases, each case will be different, and you'll have to understand the practices there, the links, the networks, everything from ethnic divisions, right, to sort of local governance networks, oligarchic communities. You need to understand there's just pure daily practice, right? Several interviews I spoke with in Serbia and Croatia basically said that they were told repeatedly by party officials if they didn't want to support a piece of legislation in the plenary chamber, they should go out for a smoke, have a coffee, right? Give them space, right? Which tells you something about the nature of the political processes there, right? Which you wouldn't expect solely from looking at the formal voting record, right? If that's the reason why people aren't showing up, it's because the party leader told them not to. That tells you something, right? So yeah, I think in terms of the EU's capacity to support the region and then the new candidate states, more time and effort should be invested, right? You need to have people going there. You need to have people studying the region. But I don't think anything is, all things are possible, right? From my research, I found that, making these connections, bringing the humanity back in to political processes can be effective at sort of supporting more durable change. So I don't think that anyone in the commission is going to read my book, but hopefully if they do, then they can draw these lessons from it too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. That was super interesting. A great presentation on a very incredibly timely topic. I also maybe have to suggest setting up a jazz band or something of the EU Values Network to build some stronger collaboration.
I'm here if you need me, right? Just shine the saxophone signal and I'll be there.
Amazing. Well, joking aside, we are really so pleased and so honored to hear about your first book. And now we'll turn to our expert discussant with us today, Irena Petrovic, for your thoughts and reflections. And just quickly, I would love to remind our audience here today that we have a Q&A that will begin soon. So yeah, I invite you to send your questions in the Q&A window. You'll find it at the bottom of the screen there. Over to you, Irena. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry. Let me. There you go.
Okay, now I'm ready. Thank you very much, Emily, for introducing me. First of all, I would like to say that I'm sincerely grateful for the opportunity to discuss this book today, and I want to thank Alexander once again for the invitation. And I think that we will have interesting discussion. First, I will share my thoughts and my impression on the book, and then ask Alexander some question about his book. Okay, at the beginning, several important aspects of the book should be emphasized, and let's begin with the comparative analysis of 3 countries that Alexander included in the research: Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. At the beginning, I want to point out that this is a comprehensive study of the political processes in this region, with a particular focus on how formal political networks and connections influence the European Union accession. I can really say that studies of this nature are generally rare, especially in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And because of the analysis of the elite and the comparative perspective, this book reminds me of a book published 50 years ago in the 1970s, titled "Opinion Making Elite in Yugoslavia." So 50 years ago, the authors analyzed the Yugoslav different, but they analyzed the Yugoslav elite social regions and various informal and formal processes. Since the publication this book, I'm not sure that there has been another similar comparative studies that examines political elite, which makes this study particularly important in understanding political and social dynamic, not only in the former Yugoslavia, but also beyond. Another significant contribution of this book lies in the analysis of the informal connections and the network among the political elite. Studies on political elite, as we know, as we can suppose, are very rare due to the challenges involved in conducting them, as Alexander clearly explained in his presentation and in his book. One interesting thing, he highlighted that one reason he struggled to connect with these respondents was that is foreigner, and he could get in touch with them only through informal contacts, through informal networks. But however, I don't think that is the main reason, because I participated in some research of political elite 10 years ago, and I have all of us in this team has the similar or the same experience. We reached the majority of respondents through the informal contacts and informal networks, and I have to say this. This situation. And because of that, the difficulties of researching political elites further emphasize the importance and the significance of this study. And at the same time, this research significantly improves our understanding of the political roles in the European Union accession process. But in my opinion, perhaps the most significant contribution is in this book is the methodological approach that Alexander used. Alexander used a mixed method approach, combining social network analysis and comparative methods, specifically the most similar system design. And for example, the second method was chosen because of the comprehensive similarities of the cases in question with a shared history and structurally similar accession process. As this study is connected with 3 different country cases, across case comparison of their various experience of joining the European Union forms a large part of this comparison. And using a combination of methodologies, the 2 different methods, Alexander presents invaluable data for understanding the reasons for very different integration paths towards the European Union. But I should also note that Alexander spoke before is fluent in Serbian, and several interviews were conducted in Serbian and Croatian, as you previously said. We know it is certainly a challenging task, but on the other hand, you came to additional and valuable insight in this way. And keeping in mind all the above, I agree with one of the reviewers who pointed out that this book will be significant readers for all scholars interested in the Western Balkans, but I would add not only for those who are interested in Western Balkans, but also for those of us from the Western Balkans, especially for our students who would gain invaluable insight from its context. Okay, I would be like in the future to see this book translated in the Serbian, because making it accessible to wider audience, and it addresses a highly relevant and timely topics. Okay, with this I will finish my comments and my impression of the book. I could elaborate further, but given the time limit, I will conclude here. And once again, I want to congratulate Alexander on his outstanding and excellent book, excellent results and study and research, and I hope he continues to engage with this topic and especially with this region. Is especially very important for us. Okay, before I ask some questions, I just want to point out that recent research in Serbia has shown a steady decline in public support for Serbia's accession to the European Union. For example, a survey conducted in April of this year revealed that only 40% of Serbian citizens favor joining the European Union, a drop for 44 the previous year. Support is especially low among young people. Additionally, 60% of citizens believe that joining the European Union would not bring significant benefits to the country, reflected widespread skepticism about these advantages. And in this context, my question is, how can we explain the decline in support for Serbia's European Union membership, and to what extent are the population negative attitudes toward European Union accession process a result of negative propaganda from the political elite, resulting from informal networks aligned against accession despite the potential rewards? And to what extent do they reflect the actual weakening of European Union? Second question, considering that Montenegro and North Macedonia are also former Yugoslav republics and are not yet member of the European Union, could the same methodological approach be applied to analyze impact of informal political networks and connection on the European Union accession processes? Additionally, would the conclusions regarding the influence of informal networks and connection in Serbia on European Union accession be applied to Montenegro and North Macedonia as well? Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Okay, I have two questions, and I hope that we will have an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irena. Thank you very much. It was really great to hear your insights. And Alexandra, if you wish, you may now respond to these reflections, these questions, and then we can also turn to the Q&A from the audience.
Sure, yeah. So, right, so the question of, yes, to what extent is the drop in support, yes, due to elite regime dynamics? So it definitely is, right? I'm hesitant to draw one-to-one correlation, simply because there's also, so the EU's had a real problem with marketing itself in the region for quite a while, and it's generally not, the EU in general is pretty bad at marketing as well, not just in the region, but also globally in Europe, right? It's been trying to do better at that, right? They've moved, the EU4U delegate office, whatever it is, right? Now to Knesset Mihailova, right? As opposed to used to be sort of slightly more on the edge of town. But this is a problem the EU's been having for a while, right? The surveys in the region also show that people assume almost a sort of a 1-1-1 ratio of support, where China, Russia, and the EU all give equal amounts of support to the region, and that is not even remotely the case, right? The EU provides a significantly more, 60-70%, right, of incoming grant support, financing, foreign direct investment, right? But it's a question then of marketing, right? And the elites definitely support, they don't support the EU's marketing narrative, right? I was in Belgrade in 2020 at the start of COVID, right? And I will always remember, Vučić, the president going to the airports to meet the Chinese airplane delivering masks. And I remember I bought a jar of honey in a market at some point, and it had a picture of a Chinese, it was like a heart with the Chinese flag and then a Serbian flag around it, which, yes, although the EU gave a lot more money overall in the long term, right, this sort of let's say, internationalist anti-EU kind of equivalency narrative is very much so supported by elites, right? So yeah, while I'm hesitant to draw one-to-one correlation, there are a lot of other actors involved, right? This is definitely something that supports the process, right? Or that is, the structure, the political elite structure in Serbia supports this decline in EU membership, I guess, right? It's a weird sentence. I come up with some other better way to phrase that. But yes, then how does it apply to other regions? For sure, right? I think you would find similar stuff in Montenegro or North Macedonia. Fundamentally, look, I think also this approach could be applied more broadly, right? I think if you applied this idea of looking at how the structure of networks within the parliaments impacts political processes, I think it could be applied more broadly, right? I applied it specifically within the region in my book because it makes that really clear comparison, which allows for isolating some of its impacts. But one other idea I have for just one of my mentors gave me, right, is actually, well, maybe applying it also to Cyprus would be good, right, during a session there, right, because then compare that with Serbia, they're both countries that have sort of unstable, sort of semi-legitimate whatever borders, right, border conflicts. You can apply it to then other countries in the region. I know there are scholars who apply this elsewhere. There's a great Ukrainian scholar, Tetiana Kostyuchenko, who did a really good social network analysis of the parliament there in and around the Orange Revolution, to study, right, how does informality impact the ability of MPs to survive political changes and things. So I think there is scope for broadening it, right? But for sure, I think, yeah, Montenegro or Macedonia would be two pretty clear places where this would be applicable. So when I get more time, I'll do more research. All avenues for the next book.
Very excellent answers and good explanation for this question.
Yes, great. Okay, so we will move to the Q&A as well. We have some questions for you. You're welcome to also read them if that's easier. Otherwise, I will read them aloud for everyone as well. Okay, so let me just put this one going. The first question, how would you describe the support structures between the different states? Do the Balkan states help each other, or are we rather trying to slow down progress in other states? Is there something like a post-Yugoslavian solidarity developing?
So I would describe it as poor. It's very halting, very stop-start. They're generally, as the states are not particularly trying to help each other. There's a lot of competition between the two, or attempted obstruction of other countries' efforts. Now, there is structured cooperation through various EU-run programs, right? There are also some alternatives to EU-led programs, like the Open Balkan Initiative between Serbia, Albania, and Macedonia, right, to liberalize. So you can you can travel between the three countries just with an ID card. They've reduced some trade barriers. So there are some efforts, right, to sort of foster some cooperation. But in general, I would say the support structures between them are generally quite poor. I mean, yeah, it depends on which particular pair of countries you want to talk about. But yes, in general, it's not a very supportive environment, right? Which is something, you know, and it has to go, it's back and forth, right? There's it's unclear whose fault it is per se, right? The EU is insists very clear that they would like regional cooperation as part of accession, right? You need to cooperate with your neighbors to make it in. But then, of course, with sort of periodic issues with accession, right? Like when France vetoed, or Macron vetoed the opening of negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia back in 2019, there historically has been this sort of halting. You know, the countries don't want to get stuck being paired with other countries in the region during accession, right? So Montenegro, I'm sure at some level would be fine helping Albania out, but you also don't want to be associated with them because Montenegro is a front runner and while Albania is sort of a relative laggard, right? You know, so there's a lot of sort of jockeying for position, but trying to make sure that your country is sort of in the lead and unlocking more rewards, or you don't want to get tied with one of the other countries who is having issues with, you know, like you know, the Greek or the Bulgarian vetoes, right, over Macedonian accession because of the name, right? It was still the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia for 30 years after its independence, right? So you don't want to get stuck in the same level, the same process as Macedonia. So they tend to be more competitive, unfortunately, right? So I think a lot could still be done to ease the flow, right, of people, of goods, right, just to make life easier on an individual level. But you know, I'm not in charge of Serbia, so I don't get to make that decision.
Sounds like a lot to be done. Okay, question here. The second one down. Is your argument high informality, lower level of success in Europeanization?
Not particularly. So that's one reading of it. If you focus on informality in the more sort of criminal sense, the sort of more corruption-y kind of sense. But I take in the book a very broad definition of informality. Where, you know, I find informality very present in the Slovenian case, right, which did quite well, right, but it's maybe a different style, a different variety of informality, right. You know, fundamentally, I don't think you can get rid of informality. Like, we all are people, we all have friends, we all have family, you know, we all, you know, you know, we all know in life, right, which school you go to matters, right, because you're going to make connections at these places who will then follow you for the rest of your life, collaborators, connections, etc., right. You know, MPs, you know, members of parliament talked about being friendlier with people they commuted with, right? And I don't know if you can legislate against that, right? If you can sort of ban that, you know. In Croatia, members of parliament said that the canteen there was subdivided based on party, right? Where, yes, in the sort of main mensa, right, in the main cafeteria, they had two big round tables, which is where the people from the two main parties sat, and then a bunch of small tables for everyone else, right? As opposed to the Slovenians who just said, yeah, you'd had lunch with your friends after the committee, you'd all grab a drink or something, right? So I don't think you can necessarily say that one is informality is bad, or if it's just I think different, right? And that's why you need the local expertise, right, to see what are the potential negative consequences of these type of connections in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, final question. Well, actually, first of all, very nice message for you, Alexander, to say that your recommendations on inclusivity and communication make total sense, and it might be it might well be that my commission colleagues will read the book. So there you go. For sure. Okay, question. How difficult is it to change incentives of the vested interests, political elites, so to push them towards effectively moving toward EU accession? To broaden participation through inclusion and communication certainly could help, as it can broaden the base. Can it be enough if it does not really move entrenched interests?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is definitely a problem, right? So there's no, there's no easy solution to this, perhaps, right? So the nice answer, the like optimistic pie in the sky, sort of, it would be wonderful if this worked solution, is that, well, you have more grassroots engagement, right? This then changes the politicians people are willing to support, right? You know, people become less willing to support corrupt politicians, then maybe there'd be less corruption. But we all know in practice that doesn't really like work, right? I mean, that would be nice, but otherwise, if we lived in that kind of world, you know, well, we wouldn't be having all these problems that we have, right? So it is quite difficult to push to push change for the vested interests. Yeah, so you know, a negative example, right, which is one reason why people argue that Serbia has also been sort of struggling in accession, as you know, the former prime minister of Croatia, right, Ivo Sanader, right, then went to jail for corruption after retiring because of his role in facilitating the sale of previously state-owned property, right, which, you know, so that was a vested interest in favor of accession. Was that good for the country? Like, well, it's in the EU, okay, but, you know, is that good practice? No. You know, and so now that he's in prison, right, it sort of raises potentially the stakes, right, for other countries involved, right? But I think through socializations, you could still have some change there, right? If you can convince people that there are alternatives, right, you know, that there are different life paths that don't necessarily require playing this exact game, right? The sort of thing where, okay, we need to defend our vested interests, otherwise, you know, we're going to go bankrupt or we're going to be overthrown, right? Or, you know, yes, it's going to be some tragedy if I lose this small sort of this piece of the pie that I'm sort of willing to defend, you know, with my life, right? If you can sort of change that sort of elite cultural environment to let people know that no, there are other alternatives, right? You can give up on this and it'll be okay, right? In Slovenia, members of parliament spoke about there were attempts by. It was a big industry in Slovenia where people had duty-free shops, right, on the borders with Italy and Austria, right, where people from Italy or Austria would pop over the border, buy a bunch of really cheap products, right, duty-free, and then pop back across the border, right? And it wasn't the biggest part of the Slovenian economy, but it was, you know, they existed. They had a sort of people were lobbying for it, right? And, you know, they didn't manage to successfully stop accession, right? But they had sort of, you know, they managed to get some sort of other support in there, right? To sort of ease their transition away, to sort of ease the decline of that specific industry, right? While protecting the people involved in some capacity. And so I think if you are able to build these sort of more substantive structures there, right, that sort of make people feel included and address some of those anxieties and change their expectations of what business culture like should be, right? What are the norms of the sort of business environment, you know, political business relations, right? Then I think maybe there's scope for progress there, right? But no, I can't unfortunately give you a 3-page policy brief on how to fix Serbian like business political connections. But you know, that's what my research says, at least at this stage. So
maybe the next webinar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, if I solve it, I'll super be back 100%.
For sure. Okay, so our last, it's more of a comment, I suppose, for your reflections than a question per se. This is from Tena. If I understood well, you stated that the EU spent more for later candidate countries, that Croatia received more than Slovenia and Serbia has received even more. However, it should be noted that IPA funds for EU candidate countries are peanuts compared to the structural funds that current EU member states receive. To put it simply, Bulgaria, a comparable size, receives much more than Serbia from the EU. This does nothing to support the convergence with EU member states, quite on the contrary. Of course, one needs to think about in whose hands that money ends up, whether political elites are the best recipient if the aim is to support democracy and the rule of law. But the premise that more money is being invested in those countries is false. Don't know if you have thoughts on that statement.
No, that is a huge problem, right? That's definitely a concern. So yeah, more money is being invested. You know, the current candidate countries get more money than previous candidate countries did during the recession. But yeah, 100% the EU member states get more money than candidate countries, right? Which is a huge problem for convergence. You know, the idea that, you know, there's been, you know, the EU is now trying to invest more money in there. They got the growth plan. I personally still don't think that that's going to be sufficient, right, to actually get convergence to happen. You know, but the idea, right, is that behind that is now there's more of a recognition, right, that actually, yes, you know, investing small amounts of money in countries in the region which still mean that they're falling behind EU member states, right, is a bad, you know, is once again is an image problem, right? It's a problem for the process, problem for the rewards, right? You know, if people in Serbia, you know, you go over to Romania or Bulgaria, and every time you go over, life there seems better, and your life is just worse and worse by comparison, then, well, you know, what's the point of this long 10, 14-year process, right? So yeah, there is a push to provide sort of slightly, to provide more support. Is it sufficient? I'm not sure. And as to who the money should go to, yeah, that is, so there's a deeper fundamental question about accession, right? Of, is the EU willing to, under the structure of conditionality, right? As levels of democracy go down, the EU should reduce its support, right? But that then opens up a problem of, does the EU cut off funding to Serbia because it's not sufficiently democratic to receive the aid, right, under the strict rules? And it can do that, right? But then, well, okay, that's going to be damaging for the Serbian economy. It'll be very difficult on a personal level, right, for all of these Serbian pro-EU individuals, right, who've been campaigning, pushing, right, trying to sort of further develop these links, right, to suddenly be told that there's no more money coming in, right? Sorry, please, good luck sorting out your democracy before we help more. So yeah, it's created a bit of a contradiction right at the heart of the process. We will see if more money makes it better, or if the more money going through certain channels will make it better, right? I think if there's a broader structure for investment, that could be useful, as opposed to solely passing it through sort of key central individuals. But yes, the idea behind a more inclusive, broader process would be to get money to diffuse more effectively throughout the system, right? To try and bypass specific roadblocks and bottlenecks, right? So that, if everyone does have more money more broadly, right, everyone sees that this process is working, then it builds a broader inclusive coalition, which can overcome the well-connected veto players. Once again, am I optimistic about the growth plan? No, but that might be more of a congenital Balkan depressiveness, right? Than an analysis, but we'll see. I mean, fingers crossed it works. It would be nice. It would be nice, but I still don't think that the EU is providing quite enough support to the region.
Yes, an interesting point to, I think, close the Q&A on. And we'll actually thank you, everyone. That does bring us to time for the webinar today. What a fantastic conversation to have been a part of. And thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Irena, and everyone at home that joined us today. If you'd like to rewatch any of this or share it more widely, it will be on our website in the coming days and our YouTube. So yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Have a great day.
Beautiful. Thank you.